Hello and welcome. Welcome, one and all, to Explain Like I'm Five, BSV Blockchain. It's a lovely rainy day here in Georgia, and I'm most delighted to speak today with Darren, otherwise known as Deggen. He is a brilliant leader and developer, community builder, and technology builder, fortunately here in the BSV ecosystem with us all for years and years. And today we will talk about the realization of a concept first articulated in the Bitcoin white paper. That is simplified payment verification to scale the utility of blockchain for the entire world of enterprise and all the people everywhere to use into the future for many hundreds, who knows, maybe even thousands of years. Let's see. So, I'd love to start with a reading of the white paper. So, you can get your own copy. I have here Simplified Payment Verification. Section 8. It is possible to verify payments without running a full network node. A user only needs to keep a copy of the block headers of the longest proof of work chain, which he can get by querying network nodes until he's convinced he has the longest chain, and obtain the Merkle branch linking the transaction to the block it's timestamped in. He can't check the transaction for himself, but by linking it to a place in the chain, he can see that a network node has accepted it, and blocks added after it further confirm the network has accepted it. As such, the verification is reliable as long as honest nodes control the network, but is more vulnerable if the network is overpowered by an attacker. While network nodes can verify transactions for themselves, the simplified method can be fooled by an attacker's fabricated transactions for as long as the attacker can continue to overpower the network. One strategy to protect against this would be to accept alerts from the network nodes when they detect an invalid block, prompting the user's software to download the full block and alerted transactions to confirm the inconsistency. Businesses that receive frequent payments will probably still want to run their own nodes for more independent security and quicker verification. So, thank you for listening to my recitation of the white paper, Section 8, SPV. Oh, thank you. And now, welcome to the stage, the one, the only, Deggen.
What an intro. Thanks, Rory. How are you?
Oh, lovely. Yes, it's really rainy here in Georgia. So, how's the weather where you are?
In Texas, it is like a hazy weather here. It's very warm. It's like an armpit. I've been told by some locals that this happens sometimes, and it might even be sand from the Sahara Desert being kicked up into the atmosphere and then eventually covering as far as Texas. I heard that happened in the Canary Islands when I visited there many years ago, but I didn't realize how far the sands could go. So apparently that's what's happening in the region at the moment. Pretty weird.
Oh, how amazing. It just shows how we're all interconnected on the earth.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, good. Well, I'm glad you're down in Texas. So have you bought a Stetson hat yet?
You know what? I don't have a Stetson. I think it's time though. I mean, I've been here for 2 years now.
Go
I think I've
on.
earned the right. I've been to my first rodeo, so I'm no longer a noob.
Oh, get yourself one. Yeah, they're
Yeah,
fabulous.
absolutely.
Good. Well, I was watching your BSV town hall and was
Mhm.
most impressed by you and all of the participants. I just thought, wow, what a great idea to put this out there. Let us all know what's going on. And you gave a brief on the SPV. So take us
Yeah.
away, Deggen. What's the latest with that?
Sure. So, I mean, my focus has been SPV and making that easier for developers to implement for the past maybe 2 years. Originally, I had a brief spell with Nchain just to help them work on some libraries that they were doing on behalf of the BSVA. And that's gone through several iterations of improvement, feedback with the ecosystem. A lot of it's been difficult to get into the hands of people. They're very reluctant to adopt the principles that you so eloquently outlined from the white paper there. And it's safe to say that in 15 years or whatever it's been now, there are very few implementations that have actually adopted SPV as their sort of principle of how things work. Really, because of the last sentence there, I think it refers to uh, most businesses that do high volume transactions would want to run their own node. And to be fair, that is the sentiment, at least, that a lot of serious businesses in the ecosystem do want to run their own node. But that's getting harder and harder, more expensive. And so really a lot of the work that I do and that the team at the BSVA does is considering a future where we have teranode scale. So if we have 1 million transactions per second, that gets very expensive very quickly. So it's all fine and well doing tests, but if the entire ecosystem thinks that running a node so that they can facilitate their transactions, so an average business, say, perhaps generates, I don't know, let's just say at the very most 100 transactions per second, that would be reasonable, I think, in terms of like a high volume business, just serving customers in a sort of exchange capacity or whatever it is they do. Like 100 a second is not low. Now imagine that they have to process 1 million transactions per second just so that they can facilitate their 100. Then you start to see how the economics don't really work out. So SPV hasn't really been a thing that people have bothered with, mostly because it's so cheap to do 7 transactions per second that you would never even consider building elaborate software to avoid processing all those transactions, because it's negligible, the actual processing power that's required to do that kind of transactions per second. In the BSV world, we're starting to see some periods where, when there's a real big impulse of usage, perhaps a new token is released and people are really excited about it and they come on and they use that, or a new game is released and they want to use that. We have a burst of transaction activity in the order of a few thousand transactions per second. That's really what we've seen in BSV that we haven't really seen across other Bitcoin-like blockchains. So then we start to see, okay, some indexing services can't really keep up with that global traffic because they're optimized so that they're not too expensive for the normal volume that we see day to day, which is much more like in the hundreds. So yeah, there's been no business driver to adopt SPV, but at the BSVA we have to be forward thinking. We have to think of the future, and so we've developed a bunch of tools that implements SPV as close to the description that you read in the white paper there, with some practical considerations for the current ecosystem in terms of what the popular payment protocols are these days, 15 years later. So
Yes,
that's where we're at.
I've been taking a digital marketing science course, and just yesterday in the class, they did give an example of how sometimes you need to make the market. So there could be something that doesn't exist yet that you need to educate your consumers about, or your clients, that, hey, this is coming and look at what this will do for you. And the example that they gave in the class was Uber. When Uber came along, there was this great need, but no one had seen it yet. No one knew of it. And then it's just taken over to be this great convenience all around the world in many places. So that really inspired me. I thought, oh, that's what we've all been doing all this time in BSV. Is really you've been building, and we've all been learning and educating the market. So to prepare the market for this wonderful opportunity. And I did also watch the Global Blockchain Conference recording of the just brilliant and wonderful Jad Wahab. He gave 2 examples of SPV that I loved. I want to share. The
Mhm.
first would be if you, for example, are Google and you have all of your data centers all around the world. And then there's me, a user. I say, oh, I want to have a Gmail address. Well, I can use that Gmail. I don't need to then go out and buy hardware and build up a server in my basement or in my attic because I have a
Right.
Gmail account. So this is an example of SPV, and that to be a user, you don't need to run the entire global infrastructure transaction throughput in order to just verify your, say, 100 transactions, like you gave in the example. And the other example that he gave, which I loved, is you don't need to fly a helicopter to cross the street. That could be maybe super cool if you had one at your disposal, but it's not necessary. There are other ways for you to cross the street than to fly a helicopter.
Right. It's very wasteful. Yeah, those are good analogies. Uh, absolutely. Yeah.
And
It's really, yeah, another analogy that comes to mind. There's construction all around me here in Texas, so it's like using a large digger to really just pick up a piece of paper. It's kind of that gives the right sort of ridiculousness, I think.
right, or like planting a garden, you could use a spade or a kazenkai or whatever they're called. So
Right.
yeah, well, what are some real world use cases? Because to me, when I read the last sentence, I called to mind one of the participants in the town hall was familiar with Amazon Web Services, and he seemed keen to learn more about SPV. So, hypothetically, we could say that if there were a large business that found this very useful, such as one with the amazing throughput of transactions like Amazon Web Services, then how
Mhm.
could they utilize this resource today?
Right. So it's all about cost reduction and efficiency. So if you imagine there will be Terra nodes running at the center of the network that do have to cope with the million transactions per second or more, and more than likely they'll use services like AWS to spin up the massive compute power that you need and database really database throughput that you need to be able to facilitate that kind of um, massive verification work and block assembly work and so on and so forth. Um, whereas if you're a business that's maybe just like a retailer that's keen to facilitate Bitcoin transactions for your own business purposes, you probably don't want to spend millions of dollars on infrastructure for the good of uh, everyone out there using the BSV blockchain. You probably just want to spin up services that are specifically serving your business and there's an associated revenue. So, any server you spin up on any service, whether that be cloud or if you're spinning up a server in your local office and you want to allow people to connect to that from the internet, all of those things have an associated electrical bill. They all have an associated upfront cost to buy the hardware or a monthly cost to sort of rent the rack space and the compute power if you're working with a cloud provider. So that obviously scales in that the more compute power you need, the more bandwidth you need, the bigger the bill. And if you have transactions that you're facilitating for your business, there is associated revenue. And then you have everybody else's transactions, which are not associated with revenue. So it's really as simple as running the infrastructure for your own transactions while trying to reduce the burden on your own services that other people's transactions have. So that's the way I think about it, and the way that businesses can make use of SPV to reduce their infrastructure costs is really adopting SPV. And so what that means is rather than having what I would call a global listener. So, in other words, a computer that listens to network traffic on the BSV blockchain and sort of listens to everything, so everybody's transactions and processes them. This is a sort of typical approach where you have the software that a miner would run. You would run that same software, and it sort of It's set up to accept all transactions and process them into blocks. So it makes sense for a miner to listen to all transactions, but it doesn't really make sense for a business that just wants to deal with their transactions to do that. So instead, you would spin up something like an SPV wallet, um, which really ingests transactions differently. So, in other words, the way in which the transactions arrive at that service is kind of just like a web API. Any server that's just receiving transactions. The difference is that it's not actively listening to all transactions on a peer to peer network. Rather, it's just exposing an API that's just for their users. So now, as a user of that business, if I have a transaction that's relevant to them, i.e., I need to pay them for some service they're providing, then I just build a transaction on my local device of some sort, and I send it to their servers. And then they can validate that using this simplified payment verification process and accept that transaction into their database. And they would keep that for their records. And I would keep the transaction for my records. But nobody else really needs to know anything about that. It's a private transaction between the two parties. So, yes, they then broadcast that to miners who need all the transactions. But that's just pushing out a transaction that they are interested in and then getting confirmation that that transaction has been included in a block. So if we take this approach, you're just dealing with a far lower number of transactions per second and a far lower bill at the end of each month for your various compute services and storage.
Wonderful. That's good for the business. And it sounds to me like you're describing a form of specialization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is part of the wider transformation of the network topology. That's sort of an ongoing process. It's maturing into the earliest example of maturation is the miners, the hashing machines that compete to find a low number associated with the mining of a block of transactions. So that's hyper specialized at this point. But no other area has specialized to that extent. And now we're beginning to see that happen. SPV is what allows that specialization on the service layer. And what we're talking about now is sort of part of the service layer as well, in that some services can just use SPV as if they were a wallet at the edge of the network. But predominantly, it's for peer-to-peer communications right at the edge. So user to user, if I send you a transaction, you should be able to validate that independent of anyone else. So absolutely, it's part of specialization.
And you've touched on the concept of the Bitcoin mandala.
Yeah,
So you mentioned at the edges there that the SPV wallet would be functioning at the edges.
right,
So could you be artistic here and tell me how can I imagine or see this? How is the
right.
SPV wallet within the Bitcoin mandala?
Yeah, so mandala being the Sanskrit word for circle. So it's circles over circles. If you Google it, you can see a really nice image of um, what a traditional mandala looks like. And that's a good image to hold in your mind when you're imagining this specialization at the various layers of the network. So we can imagine a sort of complete graph at the center of the network. So a complete graph meaning every mining node connects to every other mining node. There aren't many nodes that actually, there aren't many businesses that actually produce new blocks on the BSV blockchain. But we can imagine that as it gains popularity, more and more businesses may compete. But it's likely to be in the order of sort of 10, 20, something like that. And right now it's like 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. Um, so the point is that they're all very highly connected because they need to communicate every single transaction. And as that number goes up, there's more and more incentive to stay directly connected to each of them. So that's the central circle. But then there are sort of other circles uh, that appear further out, perhaps on a service layer, just out from those miners. You can imagine that these services would provide things like the ability to look up any data. So if you have data that's in a transaction, you would likely retrieve that from one of these outer service layer or overlay networks. So you can imagine those circles are appearing outside of that central one. And then finally, we have many, many, many little circles all over the place around the outside and the edge of the network. So these are representing the users who predominantly interact with each other. And otherwise, they propagate transactions to a service layer, which then propagates it to the center. So you can imagine this big circle in the middle, and then smaller circles all around that, and even smaller circles around that. And that's a good representation to keep in your mind of the sort of the order in which the direction in which transactions propagate. But lots of data is generated on the outside of the network and comes in to be ordered and time-stamped by that central cluster of nodes. And really, all that comes back is a Merkle path or a block header proving inclusion of those transactions. And any of the wider data is really held in this sort of service layer that surrounds that main circle. So that's the mandala, how I imagine it in my head.
Thank you. That is wonderful, beautiful, and crystal clear. I can see it as you
Yeah.
describe it. And so thank you for that. I've really been trying to see this over these weeks on Explain Like I'm Five. And I feel like today, in this moment, you really crystallized it.
Good.
So woohoo, we're on onwards and upwards. And what are some real life examples of businesses that could be using an SPV wallet? Could you make up some kind of an example that is easy to see? Maybe a grocery store or a small shop or
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, so the first use case that we're building towards with a partner company as a sort of proof of concept is exactly that. It's a market, an open market rather than a grocery store, but the analogy still works. So you can imagine perhaps, well, if we since we're both in the States, we can imagine going to I don't know, what's your local grocery store?
there are so many, but one that I just found that I absolutely love is Patel Brothers.
Patel
It's a
Brothers. Okay.
celebration of Indian cuisine culture, and
Okay.
they have it's wonderful. So let's use them, Patel Brothers.
Sounds great. So if the Patel brothers were to operate an SPV wallet, they we can call them a merchant, let's say, um, and you can imagine that um, customers frequenting the Patel brothers grocery store would grab their basket of goods, take them to the checkout, and usually in grocery stores, you won't have good signal. Really, they're usually big boxes that are held up by metal girders. So effectively, they're a Faraday cage, and signal, it's quite hard to get signal in most grocery stores. At least they will have blind spots here and there. So let's just imagine that the cashier happens to be in a signal blind spot, and you don't actually have internet despite having a smartphone. So this is where SPV gets quite interesting because the onus is on the actual device to store really the tokens that are available for the user to spend. They're storing their own spendable tokens on their mobile itself. So what that allows is, so long as the merchant has a broadband connection, which they presumably do as part of their cashier system, the user can pay for their groceries by signing some of the tokens they have on their wallet and directly transmitting that signed transaction to the merchant terminal. So kind of like when you're tapping a card or waving your Apple Pay. It's really much closer to Apple Pay. I don't know if you've ever used that, but there's a
Often,
small
yes.
Yeah, right. It's getting really popular here. When I first came to the States, it wasn't available everywhere, but these days it really is. So you kind of wave your phone, and there's some near field communication that's going on. So SPV would work just like that. You send the signed transaction to the merchant terminal, which is expecting it. There's a little exchange between them. So with card operators, there's kind of a challenge and a response code. But with SPV, it's something similar. Really, the terminal would say, "Hey, I have this this sort of basket of goods ID number and an associated cost. Here are the outputs that I need you to pay to transfer your tokens to, for me to accept the payment." And so the phone would hear that message, produce a transaction that fulfilled the terms set forth by the merchant terminal. The user would do some sort of Face ID, which under the hood would be signing the transaction, and then send it back to the merchant terminal. So the merchant terminal would then be connected to the internet, so it would then broadcast that transaction, probably to some overlay network that was specific for its business purposes, that recognized things like its coupon codes and things like that, ready discount. And otherwise, it would be a generic BSV transaction. So it would be sent to the miners, propagated, mined into a block. And instantly, the customer, without having connected to the internet at all, would be able to walk away with their groceries, because it's really an instantaneous validation. So rather than sending a transaction from your phone off to the miners and then waiting for the merchant to find it among all of the other transactions, you're just directly passing the transaction to them with evidence that the tokens you're sending to them were actually valid and have been included in a previous block in the blockchain. So if you give them all of that information, they don't need anything else. They can validate that that is all legitimate. They can run what's called script verification, which really just checks that you've signed over ownership of those tokens to them. And they do that within a few milliseconds. They can do that. So traditionally, we've called this zero conf, because there is no confirmation that the new transaction has been added into a block on the blockchain. But the merchant doesn't really care about that for the kind of money that we're discussing. So for a basket of groceries, although that number is obviously skyrocketing in recent years.
Really?
But to stay on point, for once the customer goes home and says, "Thanks, Patel Brothers, lovely stuff. I've got my ingredients to make my own curry," presumably, then they're quite happy. They have received acknowledgement from the merchant terminal that their transaction was accepted. So they mark the tokens in their own wallet as spent, so that they don't accidentally respend them. When they get outside, their phone reconnects to the internet, and what it would do is basically sync that transaction. It would send it probably to something like ARC, which is just a generic overlay. Really, the only reason they would send that is because they have change outputs that they would then need to spend in other transactions. So they just want to make sure that they have the most recent block height. They want to make sure that they know where their transaction was actually added within the blockchain for future transactions. So next time they need to make one, they know that they have the smallest amount of information necessary to prove to the next merchant they go to that their tokens are all valid still. So they kind of do a sync like that.
And that user, the shopper that bought the goods, I mean, when I went, I did buy some ready-made curry. I bought some curry ketchup. I bought some grapes. They had a little bit of everything there. Amazing freezer section, just fabulous. But, when I bought everything, then that is spent. And then you're saying that, I wouldn't need to then go to track. I would get my receipt. I could look and see what I spent on the receipt. But for my unspent transactions, would I call up another service to say, "Hey, can you verify this for me?"
So What you would do is, so as I was saying, once you're outside, you would send the transaction to a generic overlay like Arc. What Arc would do is just let you know when the miners do include it in a block. They would send you something called a callback. They basically, instead of you reaching out to them, they'll reach out to you and send you the confirmation of where that transaction exists in the blockchain once that happens. So on average, you'll wait 5 minutes for that. Um, and this is something that the user doesn't really need to interact at all. It's just something that sort of happens automatically in the background. The only reason that's important to the user is it reduces the amount of information that they then need to give to the next merchant. So imagine that that doesn't actually happen. They want to make a purchase within that 5 minute period, very quickly thereafter. Perhaps they go to the hair salon next door or something, and they want to sort of prepay for their haircut or something like that. So it's immediate. Then what they need to do is actually include the same information that they sent to the grocery store of their sort of existing tokens and their availability. And they would add the grocery store transaction to a sort of stack of information proving a chain of signatures before making the new transaction to the hair salon. So you can imagine that this could go on indefinitely. Say if they never connect to the internet, they would just have a big long chain of all of their transactions, and they would have to pass that to everyone they wanted to make a transaction with, because that chain of signatures is what proves that their tokens are valid. So as soon as they can connect to the internet and they can receive new Merkle paths for their most recent transaction, that chain then shortens to just the most recent transaction only. So you can imagine that this chain kind of grows. If you're in you're at the bar and it's underground somewhere, there's no Wi-Fi, so you're not connected, and you're just exchanging trading cards, NFTs with your friends at the pub or something like that. So you can imagine you can make a really long chain of transactions, which are all completely legitimate. And then when you come up from the pub, when you go outside, grab a taxi or whatever, you're connected. Those all get broadcast, and you receive a Merkle path proving the last transaction's inclusion in a block. Then from then on, the only information you need to include in future transactions is just that most recent transaction. That's your sort of source transaction for the funds that you're spending, so to speak.
And would we need to be using the currency of the system, or could we use other currencies in an SPV wallet?
Hmm. Yeah, that's something that we're building towards, is using any tokens. There's an element of needing to connect to a service for tokens that doesn't exist with the base unit. So if you're just using Satoshis or BSV, you don't need to do any additional validation because it's the base unit. Whereas if you're exchanging like a stable coin or NFTs, really the onus is on the issuer of those tokens, the entity that is doing the tokenization of the physical item that the token represents. They may need to do validation on whether or not the exchange is legitimate. So the reason being that perhaps there is some jurisdictional consideration that you need to make. Um, if we think about national currencies, perhaps there's a stable coin associated with a country, and they have specific laws that their their legislators have agreed on, to keep funds within sanctioned countries or something like that. And then you can imagine that actually a transaction from someone in a sanctioned country to someone in, I'm sorry, from someone in the host country to someone in a sanctioned country, you can imagine that they would normally reject that transaction as illegitimate because of their legislation or whatever. So that's a bit of a hypothetical. I don't know how serious that hypothetical is, but that's the scenario you can imagine where it would be important to have an internet connection, because one of the transactions in that chain could be rejected. So it's a different story if you know for sure the transaction won't be rejected. So, for example, if you're among friends and you're trading NFTs, like I described before, obviously you know that all of those transactions are legitimate and within jurisdiction, and there would be no restriction on you trading those NFTs at all. So for that particular use case, there's no worry, and you can just transmit all of those transactions, broadcast them to the blockchain later when you leave the pub, or sort of automatically. But if there's something like a CBDC where there are some restrictions, then presumably they will enforce those. And what you would find if you had a chain is, uh, if they look legitimate, then your wallet would accept them. But when it comes to broadcasting, one of them in the chain would be rejected based on whatever rules they're enforcing that particular token. So obviously, it gets a little complicated, and my understanding of how CBDCs operate in jurisdictions is limited. Technically,
Mhm.
it would work, but how they want to set up the rules of a particular token is really up to the issuer.
Right. And that's something that is currently piloting all around the world. So you're
Right.
also talking about how the SPV wallet meets current needs, but visualizing for how it could meet future needs as well with different currencies, currency
Right.
opportunities. And how
Yeah.
about
So,
with, oh, sorry, go ahead.
what you're talking about there is probably covered by a pairing of an SPV wallet and an overlay. So, a specific overlay service that's designed for a particular token, be that a stablecoin or whatever. But let's just say, rather than a stablecoin, let's just say like a coupon token for Patel Brothers. Or, was it Patel Brothers, or am I just making that up here?
Yes, no, you're totally right.
Yeah.
And
So,
I would love a
say
coupon. Yes.
right. So if Patel Brothers had their own little coupon currency, they could set up an overlay that was specific to their store credit, basically, and there would be far fewer restrictions on sort of trading that, considering it's basically private money, which is similar to how BSV is treated in the states, as far as I understand. Um, so yeah, that would certainly work in that case. You could trade Patel Brothers coupons all night, and then in the morning you would know that they were all valid transactions. You would just pair that with an overlay service for that purpose.
And how would an SPV wallet relate to Internet of Things and places where you're not actually purchasing something? It's not a consumer to business, but it could be data to data.
Yeah, it's certainly SPV is still useful in that scenario, but certainly the SPV wallet specifically is designed for peer-to-peer payments. So that's a sort of
Ah,
first use
okay.
case.
Hmm.
But I would say most data applications really just need the overlay services part, which also uses SPV. It's just not the main part of its name. It does use SPV though. For example, if there are sensors all over your field reporting back various temperatures, moisture levels, all of the things that those IoT devices do, they would most likely be communicating back to some sort of control system that was speaking directly to those sensors. And that control system would run, in effect, an overlay service which was writing data to chain and retrieving Merkle paths back, basically for data integrity purposes. So that if somebody wanted to read the data, perhaps historical data from these sensors, they would be asking that overlay service for the data. They'd read it back, and it would come along with Merkle paths, proving that essentially it's a timestamp. It's an immutable timestamp to prove that the data has not been manipulated, and you can independently verify that the data hasn't been manipulated and that it was submitted at a particular time by running SPV. So in this case, it's not really SPV, it's SDV, like uh,
Ah,
simplified data verification, although that's a
right.
term I literally just invented, but that's
Ah,
kind of more what it is, right?
yes, you're so creative. Yeah, last week we had on Britt Trago, and she was focused on the Ocean Defender app that
Mm.
is enabling people to pick up the rubbish and take photos and verify that they have picked up this rubbish from a water feature, maybe a river, a lake, an ocean, a beach scene, and then they can uh, chronicle that they have, in fact, uh, put it in the official repository for that particular type of rubbish to go into the recycling system. And
Wow, that's
so,
awesome.
yes, it's super exciting. And she's really inspired me. I've been collecting glass bottles all over town. I'm saying, I'm taking these to the official receptacle. I'm still going to use her app, even though I'm not at the beach, and just, to have it as a record so I can see later a record of all the recyclables that I have put up in the right place. But how would an SDV, let's say, simplified data verification, work in her app, or as an example?
Yeah, yeah. I suppose so. There's a couple of things that need to be verified. So who did it? Oh, uh, so you need some sort of identity system, which could be as simple as using the sort of existing services that do that sort of identity check. Could be pretty simple. It could be self-reported. Could be a case of just associating your uh, public key with the things that you do. So it doesn't necessarily need to have your name on it or anything like that. Just your public key becomes a pseudonym, and then you could build up a reputation for this pseudonym being a good citizen that clears up the recyclable uh, uh, garbage that they come across in nature. So that so yeah, some sort of identity system, which just means a really basic public key infrastructure. And the way that SDV would work is um, validating that someone hadn't just created a bunch of records attesting to work that they haven't actually done just in order to receive credit for having done real work. Um, so what do you need for that? Probably peer verification, something like that. So certificates saying, yes, this person did this, where there's no incentive to cheat. There are some things, of course, in blockchain that aren't really solvable with blockchain. They're just human problems that need some sort of governance otherwise, and that might be one of them. But certainly, ensuring that the data that's reported over time is very easy. In that you can make a report and you can prove that the report was made at a specific time. So you can imagine that if you're some sort of hacker that is just trying to game the system, you really have to create all of the data at the time you're doing the hack, which presumably is just like today. So it's impossible to create data in the past within the blockchain. So you sort of missed the boat. So the way that you would prove to others that you really had been collecting things for the past year, say, is you have a bunch of Merkle paths that point to transactions in particular block heights. Those block heights are known to have occurred at a particular time. And so if you have evidence that says, me, as in this public key, as signed by this public key, this event took place. And that is something that you can't fake as easily because it's taken you a whole year to generate that array of data.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
what companies that currently exist in the BSV ecosystem can start using an SPV wallet today?
What companies? Sorry, I don't know if I caught the question. What companies could use
Yes.
the SPV wallet today?
Yes, exactly. I'm assuming they would need to already be engaged in the BSV ecosystem in order to use the SPV wallet. Is that correct?
Not really. So it's the SPV wallet. It really it encompasses just one aspect of your application. So it's depending on the complexity of the problem you're trying to solve. It starts it's a good way to start getting into BSV in that it has the basics of this is how you transact with others within the ecosystem. It uses all of the sort of standard payment protocols. So, for example, if you spun up an SPV wallet today, which you can do in an hour or so, um, you could immediately send funds to it from a Handcash wallet, just as an example,
Oh,
because
okay.
it's sort of backwards compatible with the peer-to-peer destinations and peer-to-peer raw transaction paymail capabilities that Handcash uses. And most of the ecosystem wallets use that functionality. So you can imagine you're starting from a zero balance. You can fund an account with your SPV wallet instance quite easily that way. And in terms of how you would then take it forward, there's extensive documentation which you can find at docs.bsvblockchain.org, which will invite you to kind of engage with some of the high level concepts of what SPV even is, problems it solves. But it also digs down into the details for your developers to take a look at to see how they might deploy it on AWS, how they might run it locally so that they can further develop it. So example might be if you are running some store of some sort, you can just run the wallet independently, but you might also want to sort of incorporate it into your invoicing system, so that you can kind of make calls to your SPV wallet to generate a response that you would then hand to a customer directly, rather than going through the SPV wallet. So there's some payment flows, and obviously the UX would need to tie into the wallet, depending on your particular merchant store, how all of that works. Most likely, I would imagine people want to customize what the UX looks like. We have a very basic web wallet, just to sort of show you how you would use the JS client, the JavaScript client. Most developers will probably want to use that JavaScript client in their own application otherwise. So that's how you would integrate into like an existing business, to start accepting payments using that methodology.
Ah, thank you. So, anyone listening out there that has a business, has a market already set up, you can go to docs.bsvblockchain.org to access all the information and tools that you need to spin up your own SPV wallet today, maybe within an hour. And I want to give a shout out to Bridget Doran because I had seen her post on LinkedIn just prior to our call, Darren, and she
Yeah,
had shared the link to docs.bsvblockchain.org. And I was so happy it was right there. I could just click on it and it took me to the site. And she also included an image of how you can simply ask a question. It's like a search or an AI search where
that's
you
right.
can type in your question on the top left and then it will deliver the answers to you. So it makes it really easy for users. And I had heard you mention this website during your town hall, but I didn't immediately go and look up the website. So this speaks to the impact of peers sharing information, sharing knowledge. Is that we hear of it, we think, oh, I should go look that up. Then someone else looks it up, shares it, up, and then we have it. And then again, we're speaking about it here today. So hopefully, even more of us will take a moment to go to that website, the docs.bsvblockchain.org, and you can have that resource at your fingertips.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great. It's certainly been a while in the making. So lots of very dense information there that's hopefully made a little bit easier to digest by the structure and everything. It's been
Definitely.
in the works for 2 years, so
Is it? Oh, it's beautiful. And I see, first it was on a page giving me the details. And then I went and clicked on who is it for? And I thought that was very helpful that I can just click here. Um, you show your functionality and roadmap and the components of it. and it has some
Yes.
really engaging diagrams there that even I can see and grasp. I can say, wow, look at that. I see what's going on here. So, really well done on the website here. And
Thanks.
then it does go down past the introduction to installation. You have a quick start, and then there's an AWS. So it seems like people that already use AWS cloud services can then easily spin up their SPV wallet from this guide. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, perfect. Yep.
And
So
what?
it provides what's called a cloud formation template. This
Ooh,
is kind of infrastructure as code. So it really it tells AWS what various computers and databases are needed to run all of these services, and then it just goes ahead and sets that up within your own AWS account and spins up all the services in a cluster of computers that all work together to keep things working.
fantastic. And I did notice Ray at Kitty Treats on Twitter gave you a heart. She sent a heart there. So I'm sure she's already been using this or is about to with her many builds. I know that she and her colleagues, they built Gibio, which is the video streaming platform,
Awesome.
video sharing platform, and then also Molly Match game. So a lot of the people that are here can already get involved and use this. What did you call it again? A cloud
Cloud
template?
formation template. Yeah.
Ah, cloud formation template. Well,
Yeah.
clearly you've been using those here in Georgia today. We have lots of clouds in the sky and it's a tornado warning and everything. So we're all about to stop, drop, and roll. I'm joking. Yeah, but this is really a fantastic resource. Now, what question should I ask it? Can you give me a good question to type in here?
The classic thing to ask is, what is inside of a block header?
Ooh, okay. So I've asked the question and I see a little blue kind of book timing thing. And then it says a block header contains the following information. Version defines the version of this encoding format. The size 4 bytes. Previous block hash. Hash of the previous block header. Size 32 bytes. Merkle root. Hash encapsulating all transactions in the block. Size 32 bytes. Time. Timestamp of when this block was created. Size 4 bytes. Bits. Difficulty target used by miners. Size 4 bytes. Nonce, random number iterated while mining. Size 4 bytes. Then there's a list of questions next to ask in blue, such as how is the previous block hash used in a blockchain? What is the purpose of the Merkle root in a block header? And how does the difficulty target bits affect block mining? Wow, so this can really be used as a tool to educate ourselves on how the blockchain works.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should stress that the difference between this and, for example, using ChatGPT, is that if you ask ChatGPT some of these questions, you may be misinformed because it has such a wide array of resources on which it on which the model has been built and trained.
Mhm.
So whereas this particular model, although it may behave kind of like a ChatGPT, it's trained specifically on the data within the documentation. So you know for sure the answer you get actually has a source that you can find. And you can go look up that source, and you know that a human's actually written that, and you know it's the sort of official source for how this stuff really works. So ChatGPT might guess how this stuff works, whereas if you use this particular LLM, this ask a question service within the documentation page, it'll give you an answer based on our documentation. So you can be sure that it's correct.
Fantastic. Yes, it's precise and pristine. I remember Ty Everett speaking of this. from Project Babbage. I remember he felt passionate about building some LLM like this for educational purposes.
Yeah, it's definitely it's come on leaps and bounds in the last couple of years, of course. And this has been the best particular instance of it I've ever seen, honestly. The Gitbooks AI Ask API, which is what this is using, very, very cool. Really useful
Mhm.
for onboarding people. We've integrated it into the Discord. So if you join discord.gg/BSV, you can have a conversation with a chatbot by using /ask, hitting
Mm.
enter, and then you can ask your question. And in the background, it's just an integration with the documentation AI. So it will respond exactly like you've seen it there.
Wow. And I have heard this Discord a couple of times. What is it again? Discord.gg?
Yeah, discord.gg /BSV. I'm just double checking. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Slash
Discord. So
BSV.
DISCORD dot
Uh-huh.
GG/BSV.
Oh,
So that will
cool.
that will connect you to our Discord, so you can chat with the rest of the um, developers or builders in the ecosystem.
Hmm. Wonderful. What a wonderful opportunity for newbies to connect with the right folks.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll be there, happy to answer any questions that the AI can't. But it's got most of the SPV stuff covered by now. It's saving
Woo.
me a lot of time, actually.
Is it? How so?
Yeah, as in
It,
it, the common questions are always answered or
right.
answerable by this AI now.
And will you be attending the London Blockchain Conference at the Excel Center here later this month?
I sure will. Looking forward to it.
Wow. Oh, how
Yep,
wonderful.
there's a DevCon just prior to it, so I want to give a shout out to DevCon organizers. That's Monday the 20th.
Ah,
So it's
so
a
how
sort of
can
developer day.
developers go there? Do they go in person or can they join online?
They can do both, but
Okay.
yes, we're trying to encourage people to go in person. It's always good to come out of your coding cave, meet some other fellow introverts, and uh, have much needed high bandwidth conversations. It gets you there a lot faster than chat will. But for those that
Right.
can't make it to London, yes, you can join online as well. I believe that will be available.
Ah,
I must admit,
cool.
I don't know what the link is for that
Okay, I was going to
particular
ask.
DevCon.
Hmm.
Um, I think
But it will
it's
be at DevCon.
londonblockchain.net/en/devcon. There we go.
Okay.
That's how you can go to
London.
the DevCon.
Okay, let me look. You said London block. Sorry, say it again, please. Let me look it up.
londonblockchain.net/devcon.
Dot
DEVCON. Oh no, I'm sorry. You have to do /EN/devcon.
en/DevCon. Okay, could be
That's
the
the
version.
English version.
Right. Oh, looking beautiful. Okay, I see it here. BSV Blockchain DevCon. Excel London, May 20th. Book now. Time to build the future of blockchain. And I met someone who had focused on Java. They're as a developer, they've had a lot of experience with Java. And I said, oh, that's great for blockchain. Is that the case? Or what are some of the languages that you need to be well versed in to just start joining the teams and developing right away?
So part of our initiative at the moment is to make sure that regardless of which language you're coming from, there's always resources for you to get involved with BSV. Because a lot of the time these languages have their own sector, so to speak,
They
in
do.
that, for example, Elixir and Erlang are for concurrency applications largely associated with telecoms. That's an area where um, we don't officially maintain any Elixir libraries right now. There are a couple of devs in the ecosystem that do. Um, so it's an area that we're interested in building out relationships and making sure there's a well maintained stack. But that's true of Java as well. So Java is heavily used in at nchain. So that's pretty well taken care of. Although definitely, I had conversations with people just today, actually, talking about how I think we should sort of officially support that as well. Whether that means just sort of funding nchain to continue their good work, um, or perhaps finding someone to manage it if they don't want to. But yeah, certainly we have TypeScript, or in other words, we have the JavaScript ecosystem covered. We're 80% there with a Go SDK. We're about 50% there with a Python SDK. And there are considerations being made for the potential for Elixir, Rust, Swift to cover iOS developers, Kotlin to cover Android developers, which will be largely based on the Java stuff. So yeah, we're started with TypeScript and we're building out from there. So any other languages that people listening want supported, please respond to this space in the comments. Tag me, it's at Deggen, or DM me, although I don't think my DMs are open. So just tag me and be happy to consider other languages as well.
Well, thank you, Deggen. And we've reached the time for our space today. Explain Like I'm Five, simplified payment verification wallets with the BSV blockchain. And I am always treasuring a moment to speak with you, Darren. So thank you for your time
Likewise,
today.
Thank you so much for hosting. It's a real pleasure talking to you again.
You too. So bon voyage, and have a cup of tea for me in London, okay? Hopefully, I'll be there virtually if Omniscape has an option. So I'd
Very
like
good.
to, tour the site virtually. I'll have to follow up on that.
Okay. Well, until then, toodle pip.
Oh, how cute. Okay, I'll have to look up what that means. But yeah, toodle pip to you too.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, thank you. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining. I see many of our friends in the chat: Hooligan, Ray, Crypto Voyager, Krez, and many others. So we'll see you again soon. And remember, if you have any questions, just reply on the thread here and you can tag Deggen or myself, and we will look to answering those forthwith. So have a beautiful week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.